ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another wonderful edition of the Modjeska Simkins School for Human Rights. Of course, this evening we have three very special guests that I'll introduce in just a moment. But first, I want to turn the floor over to one of our wonderful students, Celine, who is an upcoming writer, who has a really important message to start us off this evening. So, Celine, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I appreciate your time. So today I'm just going to read an excerpt from an essay that I wrote a few years ago. A few years ago, I was leaning on my cubicle wall talking with a coworker. She had just come back from lunch and she seemed really agitated about something. She pointed at the bulky black frames she was wearing and asked me, "Are these some kind of code for something? Do certain people wear these?" I said, "What do you mean? Like, if you wear these glasses, do people think you're gay?" At this point, I was totally confused. Not that I know of. I think those hipster glasses are usually worn by people who are liberal-minded, so maybe there's crossover there with the LGBT community, but I've never heard of them being specifically worn by gay people. Oh, I was wondering, because this lady was hitting on me when I was at the store and just, ew. She made a face like she smelled sewage and shook her head. I'm sure my face was fixed on politely puzzled, but on the inside I was burning with anger. She continued on. "I just don't like people like that. It's fine, they can do whatever they want, but I don't want them around me. One time I went to a spa for a massage, but then I saw the lady who was going to work on me. Nuh-uh, I don't want someone like that touching all over me." I tried to inject some logic into the conversation without really revealing what side I was on, and I said, "Well, I mean, you like men. Would you let a straight man give you a massage?" She paused and then said, "I don't know." So I sincerely hope I gave her something to think about that day, something that questioned the basis of her own fear and prejudice. But since I never saw her wear those glasses again, it's probably a good thing that she never knew that I'm pansexual. It means someone whose sexual preference can include a partner of any biological sex, gender, or gender identity. Obviously, this was not the first time I'd run into prejudice aimed at sexual orientation. In high school, I had several gay friends, and I remember every one of them being singled out, bullied, or ostracized in one way or another. That hostility is probably why I didn't come out as pansexual until college. And at the time, my life wasn't affected very much when I came out to my siblings and my friends. But transitioning from the college atmosphere to a work environment brought worries to my mind that I had never considered before. It was no longer about the concern of being defined by one label and nothing else, or the possibility that some people might avoid me on campus. I realized that being out at work might have a tangible, detrimental effect on my life. For the first time since high school, I was genuinely afraid about people finding out I wasn't straight. Was I worried that people would intentionally treat me differently? Well, yeah, that was something of a concern. But I was also worried that people would think of less of me subconsciously and hinder me because of it. Our biases are more insidious than we think they are. Even someone who prides themselves on being tolerant might wind up picking a straight applicant for a promotion over a pansexual one simply because they've deeply internalized their sense of discomfort. Due to those fears, I rarely socialize with people I work with. Sometimes coworkers will suggest that the team hang out one day after work, get a beer, or go bowling, or go to dinner. I always try to find an excuse. The mask I bring to the office every day is too suffocating to wear all the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Celine. That was a great essay, and I hope to read the longer version one of these days as well, because that was a really important message. So everyone, again, give her a hand of applause. And I think that's a great way for us to transition into tonight's conversation, which is very much based around the LGBTQ rights fight right here in South Carolina. We have three very special guests here this evening. I'm going to introduce them right now, and then we'll get underway. First off is Dr. Ed Madden, who is the Director of Women and Gender Studies at the University of South Carolina and also the Poet Laureate of Columbia, South Carolina. He has, of course, done a lot of work with the Progressive Network over the years. And for those of you who were students last year, you may recall his wonderful presentation on LGBTQ history in South Carolina. After that, we have, of course, Mandy Carter, who is a lioness of the social justice movement in the South. She's been involved with SNCC, with the Poor People's Campaign. She was the founder of the Southerners on New Ground or SONG organization. and she's here this evening to talk a bit more about the importance of building coalitions and building alliances in the Deep South and across the country. And finally, of course, we have Harriet Hancock, a true living legend, a true mother of pride, who is an attorney, and she was the founder of the first chapter of Parents, Families, and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, or PFLAG, right here in South Carolina. So as you can see, we are in for a wonderful and fantastic and critical presentation tonight. And we're going to start off by going to Dr. Ed Madden. So Dr. Madden, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I sent 2 articles to Brett. I assume you all got them. One was an essay I wrote for an encyclopedia on LGBTQ issues in the United States. I wrote the essay on South Carolina. It was intended to be very historical and also to focus on legal issues. And then I also sent a paper I had written for a women's studies conference soon after the Amendment 1 anti-gay marriage amendment campaign here in South Carolina, just sort of reflecting on some of the lessons we had learned from that campaign. So what I'm going to do tonight is sort of do a real, a rapid history, a lightning history of LGBTQ South Carolina, mostly pulling highlights from the history article. And then I want to end with 4 takeaways that for me have been important in my experiences with LGBTQ work here in the state. And I want to say thank you to both Robert and Brett, and also Becky for including me again this year. I know I've done this a few times, and I very much like this opportunity to talk about LGBTQ history. I think lots of gay and lesbian people don't know our own history in this state, but probably if they don't, most of the general public doesn't know either. So this is kind of fun for me. So I'm going to break it down into 3 big categories. And then again, I'm going to end with 4 takeaways. And along the way, I'm going to put some links in the chat in case you want to follow up on something. And I have a couple of images that I'll show you as well from 80s AIDS activism that I think are kind of cool. So first of all, if we thought about history, one thing we have to think about is, how do we know our history? How can you find out LGBTQ history when basically all the records are police records or court records, right? That the only real evidence we have are a few letters maybe that people left behind that might have questionable interpretation. We have to think about how to interpret those, but otherwise it's just mostly court records. South Carolina has the oldest gay sex law in the nation. We adopted the term buggery from the 1712 English common law. And so all along in South Carolina, our law against same-sex sexuality has been buggery. Most other states switched to sodomy. And most states also decided to define sexual laws more specifically. South Carolina never did. We don't like to talk about sex, so we just kept the old 1700s word in there and assumed it would do the work. In the article, I talk about a few people who are associated with LGBTQ history in South Carolina. And I hope in the article too, I suggest the links between LGBTQ history and the history of race and ethnicity in the state, because there are interesting moments of intertwine. For example, the 2 founders of the Penn Center were likely a lesbian couple. The woman, what's her name? Sorry, I'm looking at my notes here. Laura Bragg, who worked with the Charleston Museum, was a progressive activist who first opened up the Charleston Museum to African Americans. So there are interesting moments where LGBTQ history and the history of race in the state meet each other. The 2 big, I guess I want to say just a little bit about the sodomy law. Ours, we were the last state to remove the death penalty. That was in 1869. Before 1869, you could be put to death for the crime of sodomy. Even though we changed it to 5 years and or a $500 penalty, that might look lenient compared to other states that might have had 15 or 10 or 20 years. The difference was that most other states, the judge could decide. In South Carolina, it was a required minimum of 5 years in jail. And I think the thing to remember too about our sodomy law is that it applied to straight people as well as gay people. It wasn't enforced that way, but technically any straight couple before 2003, when Lawrence v. Texas overturned it, any straight couple who had oral sex should be in jail for 5 years and pay a $500 fine. But of course, that's not how it was ever enforced. It was enforced in 2 ways. We did research right before the Lawrence v. Texas decision, and we found that repeatedly the sodomy law was still enforced in prisons. It was used to give people a third strike, to keep people in the prison industrial complex longer. So even though politicians at the time said, oh, we never enforced that, they in fact did, and mostly in prisons. And the other place it was enforced was in the courts of social opinion. I talk about that a little bit in the article, but you might think about the ways in which, for example, when there were laws, they tried to ban adoption for gay and lesbian parents because of the sodomy law. They tried to prevent USC from putting sexual orientation or non-discrimination policy, and prevent USC from adding partner benefits for same-sex couples because of the sodomy law. So even if it weren't enforced in general, it was still used to enforce discrimination and bigotry in the courts of public opinion. Two big dates maybe to remember from that early moment of sodomy and silence, I would call it. One would be 1958, the Candlestick murder in Charleston. A young airman, Charleston airman named John Mahon, was bar hopping with an older man named Jack Dobbins. When Dobbins took him home and apparently made a sexual advance on him, he took a silver candlestick and bludgeoned him to death. The court case made Dobbins out to be the villain because of his inappropriate advances. He wasn't just a young man, he was a military man. So it was an assault on American military manhood. The case too, what's interesting about it, there's a historian here named Santee Thompson who wrote his master's thesis on it. He said in other places, people expressed outrage over cases like this. In Charleston, the courtroom was silent and the newspaper coverage was very minimal. And he said, this suggests something about our culture, that in fact, we're a culture that does not want to talk about these things. And that was apparent in both the newspaper coverage and in the reaction in the courtroom. The other day would be 1968, fascinating story of Don Langley Simmons. Don Langley Simmons was moved to Charleston from England, was a biographer of royalty and other people. Charleston society adored Mr. Simmons. He went away and came back, had transitioned, and was Don Langley Hall at the time. She was accepted by Charleston society after the sex change. What caused great consternation, though, was when she married her African-American butler. And the wedding announcement in 1969 was run on the obituary pages of the Charleston paper. So it was the interracial marriage, which was just after Loving versus Virginia. It was the interracial marriage that caused problems with her in Charleston society, not her gender identity. Brett's direct messaging me saying, don't forget to leave out Mr. Hammond's fleshly pole. If you read my article, you'll see there were two Charleston historical legislators, including Hammond, who became the governor and then a US senator in 1860. But they wrote a series of letters to each other talking about poking each other with their long fleshen poles and things like that. We have the letters in the South Caroliniana Library. And when Martin Duberman, the historian, first wanted to publish them, there was all sorts of problems in South Carolina about who has access to this material, how can they use it. So if earlier I said part of our problem is that most of our records are court records, the other part is that even when there are possible evidence, possible instances of evidence, that family and history and institutions and political history can complicate any rendering of that. I hope that's enough, Brett, about the long fleshly poles. Second section I would call is cultural formation. Cultural formation and community organizing. So you probably know this, but in general for LGBTQ organizing, there are two approaches to social change. First is going to be the reform of laws and public policy. And the primary law at this time that people want to reform is the sodomy law. Because if your very act of love, relationship, sex is the grounds for criminalization, it becomes the grounds for further social stigmatization and grounds for preventing you from achieving other forms of equality. The other, though, is building institutions and building community. I like what Jim Sears said in one of his early histories of Southern LGBTQ movements. He says, before individuals could be mobilized politically, they had to be brought together socially. So we have to build a community before we can then try to change public policy. In the 1980s, obviously that organizing is going to be complicated by AIDS as a context. The first cases of AIDS were in 1981. And we should call this the first tipping point for LGBTQ politics in South Carolina. Through the 80s, you may know this, but Ronald Reagan didn't say the word until 12,000 people were dead. So there was an incredible silence around AIDS at the time. And just to give you kind of sense of how AIDS was a context for LGBTQ organizing in South Carolina, the earliest social organizing is going to be around drag culture and university culture. Those were the two places where mostly where organizations pulled people together, was in drag, the bar community, and the university. 1982 is the founding of PFLAG. Harriet's going to talk to us later, but this is the first gay rights organization in this state, was PFLAG. At that time, it was Parents of Lesbians and Gays. Now it's Parents, Friends, and Family of Lesbian and Gays. So the first organization for gay rights was actually an organization of support and of family allies. And I think it's important to remember that. That's 1982. 1983, the USC student group wins their lawsuit to get recognition. 1985 is the first AIDS service organization, which Harriet was also one of the founders of. That's Palmetto AIDS Life Support Services, which still exists now, was the first AIDS service organization. 1988, the South Carolina legislature passed the Comprehensive Health Education Act. And I'm going to come back to this because it comes back to haunt us in 2020. 1988, this act is passed. It governs sex education in the state, and it specifically says that homosexuality cannot be mentioned except in the context of disease prevention. Technically, this law only applied to the 2 or 3 hours of sex education that was required in the state. Most school administrators for the next 2 decades used it to suppress any discussion of homosexuality in a public school. For me, the best example was in 2012 when there were statewide high school debates in Rock Hill, and they were using issues that were of the moment. The Rock Hill debate group wanted to debate gay marriage, and the principal said no, and he used the Comprehensive Health Education Act as the reason for denying it. So even though it only technically applied to sex education, it was used by school administrators to suppress information and discussion across the curriculum. 1989, though, there is an ACT UP protest. So 2 things to know about this. First of all, this is the first major, major direct action protest outside of major urban centers in the United States. There had been protests in New York and San Francisco and Atlanta and DC. This is the first one. Columbia, South Carolina has that distinction. 2 activists here in South Carolina, Diana, and Brett, who was her partner in crime when they ran AIDS Busters?
I don't recall, but she brought a game board.
Bambi Sumter Gaddis.
It was Bambi Sumter Gaddis.
Yeah. So Diana and Bambi Sumter Gaddis had started doing AIDS education through hair salons, and they organized a youth group called AIDS Busters. They invited ACT UP to come here. So ACT UP from Atlanta and New York came because the South Carolina legislature had proposed a law that would quarantine anyone who was HIV positive. Think about this. April 20th, 1989, it is a Monday at noon. And in front of the State House, let me see if I can share a screen. In front of the State House, first of all, let me go to my desktop. In front of the State House, they had a kiss-in. I hope you guys can see this. And the point was just to show that AIDS is not transmitted by casual contact. So all these queers from Atlanta and New York and a few from South Carolina in front of the South Carolina State House are demonstrating against this legislation, and they have a kiss-in to prove that it's not transmitted casually. Here's another picture of the protest, silence equals death. Then they walked out into Gervais Street, right there at the intersection of Gervais and Main, and had a die-in. And a die-in is when you lie down and pretend to be dead, and you don't get up and move. You force the police to pick up your body like it's a corpse. 41 people were arrested that day. All of them were arrested, had plastic ties put around their wrists. They do that now anyway, but at the time it was because the police were afraid that they might get AIDS if they somehow broke the skin and caused blood on these people. So that's in 1989. It is the second thing to know about this, that the first thing I said is Columbia has the distinction of being the first place outside the major urban centers. Let me stop share. The second thing is that this actually galvanized us. So two people invite outside activists here. Those outside activists, I tell a story in the article about the New York activists are watching TV and some guy has a hospital mask on, which we're very familiar with now during COVID, with his silence equals death button on it. And at the end of the interview, the guy asked him if he would give his name. And he admits he's from a small town in South Carolina. And the article by David Levitt, this New York writer who thinks, oh, this guy won't come out, he takes off his mask and he gives his name and he tells the little town in bumfuck South Carolina where he comes from. And the New York activists he talks about, they're overwhelmed because here is someone for whom this is such an important moment. And he had a friend who died. He's willing to out himself on South Carolina television because of this. It is no accident that within months, Harriet Hancock and Jim Blanton and others were organizing a Pride March. And it is no accident that the very next year in 1990 was the first Pride March in South Carolina. So you can see how the national context is influenced in the state context and how AIDS becomes part of this moment of this tipping point in cultural organizing. I'm going to give you one link. If you do want to follow up on this, thinking of the 80s and 90s, one of the best stories about this, and put this in the chat, everyone, is a 1998 story from the New York Times. Oh, wrong article, wrong. Sorry. That's coming up later. Let me get, where is it? Wrong one. Here it is, sorry. It's a 1998 story from the New York Times about the Pride March that was in Myrtle Beach, but also just the larger South Carolina context of the religious right and of very conservative Republican politicians. This article is like just a great portrait of what South Carolina was like in the late 90s. And I think in some ways a great portrait for us of what still exists in some ways here. I'm mindful of my time. I'm gonna go a little quicker. So if that's the first tipping point, AIDS, I think we might think about this period ending in 2003. June 26, 2003 is Lawrence versus Texas. If you don't know that, that is the Supreme Court decision that overturned sodomy laws in all the states in the nation, not just the ones that just applied to same-sex sex, but those that applied to everyone. You should know, however, that our legislature has not taken it upon themselves to take it off the books. So we still have our buggery law on the books. It's just technically not enforceable. They could change it, but they have not done so far. The second tipping point is going to be marriage. And I think we have to remember that even if you have a good feminist critique or a good queer critique of marriage, what we knew in 2004 and 2005 is that everybody in South Carolina was going to be talking about gay and lesbian people and gay and lesbian marriage and about our relationships and our families. And we needed to be part of that conversation. So even if we did have a critique of marriage as an institution, it was important that our voices were part of the conversation. So 2004, GLPM, the Gay and Lesbian Pride Movement, did the first South Carolina marriage equality actions. I know it's simple, and I'm going to show you another picture. It's really simple, but we got 6 couples to go into desktop share, just that little picture. 6 couples to go into the Richland County Courthouse and apply for marriage licenses. And we were all dressed up with bouquets and boutonnieres. And then we walked up and down Main Street handing out cupcakes with little pro-marriage equality messages on them. We continued to do that year after year, but that was the first year that South Carolina joined the marriage equality movement in a way that it was already existing nationally. So that's spring 2004 when we started doing that. 2005, again, thinking we want to be part of the conversation. 2005, we did our first outreach at the South Carolina State Fair. I'll just say, I'll claim it. I organized that. I wanted us to do this. I wanted us to be out there. People were terrified. We had gay and lesbian people who were terrified to go out there. We already had heard that a lot of the LGBTQ folks were afraid to do neighborhood canvassing. So we thought this would be a good start, right? You're sitting at a table with friends, with supporters. We handed out little wrist bracelets that said pride and love and courage and things like that. And tons of people took them. And it was an amazing experience. So that was 2005. We also in 2005 started Rainbow Radio, which was the first gay and lesbian radio show in the state, which was done through the Air America station here in South Carolina. And again, the reason we did that is we thought if everybody's going to be talking about gay and lesbian people and about same-sex relationships, we need to be part of that conversation. And in fact, I remember our very first, we modeled it after NPR. So we ended every 30-minute segment with a little 5 to 8 minute essay. And I remember Harriet was our first one. She told the story of the first lesbian and gay pride march in South Carolina. 2006, we had our amendment. It might be worth remembering that 2004 was when the wave of all those vicious things swept across the nation. South Carolina, surprisingly, wasn't at the front of this. Thanks to a couple of legislators who used bureaucratic technicalities to keep it from moving forward. We weren't in the first wave, so we had a little time to prepare. So we were in 2006. It passed, of course, overwhelmingly. And the amendment not only prohibited marriage, it prevented any kind of recognition for same-sex couples and their families, even partner benefits from public universities, anything, any kind of recognition. I also think it's worth noting that 2006 is the first Black Pride, right? So thinking about the ways in which national movements influence state movements, but also the ways in which LGBTQ organizing is running in tandem with African-American organizing. This is the first Black Pride in 2006. 2015, of course, puts an end to it all with Obergefell versus Hodges. That's the Supreme Court decision that gave us marriage equality, but it's worth remembering again that we were actually a little in front there because the circuit court declared our law unconstitutional. So we were able to get married in mid-October, or I guess mid-November, sorry, of 2014, before the rest of the nation because of the circuit court decision. I'm going to talk a little bit about coalition building at the end, but it was important in that campaign that we did coalition building because we really, we came to the really easy recognition that if every LGBTQ person in the state voted against the amendment, we still wouldn't win. We had to have allies. We had to have other people voting with us and for us. So just that simple truth made it clear that we needed to make coalitions. And I also want to say about this, I realized very clearly during that moment that gay and lesbian community is a total fiction. We are not a monolith. Gay and lesbian people, the only thing we have in common is our sexual difference, our sexual outsider status. We are divided by racism and classism and sexism and all those things that divide American society fracture and complicate the LGBTQ community. I almost should say communities, and I almost should put it in quotes for this reason. So those are my that's my historical survey. Just a few quick updates that would be part of the story, and I didn't get them in the articles you read. First date I want to recognize is 2004, the Dunbar versus Foot Locker decision. You may not know this, and again, I'm going to put this link in the chat in case you want to follow up. 2004, Kevin Dunbar was a Black gay employee of Foot Locker here in Columbia. He worked at 2 stores. He was harassed by his fellow employees who called him faggot, who used the N-word, who called him sissy, who called him punk. His fellow employees who threw shoes at him, who knocked him off the ladder. Customers complained. He then complained officially, and even though his complaint was supposed to be treated with discretion, the manager told everyone. So he sued. With Lambda Legal's help. It was settled out of court. It was funny to me because I taught a course at USC last fall on sexuality and justice. And so we were reading the Supreme Court decisions, but we also looked at South Carolina decisions. And one of my students works at Foot Locker, and he said their diversity training begins with the Dunbar versus Foot Locker case. So part of the settlement wasn't just a financial settlement for Kevin Dunbar, who still lives in South Carolina, but was required diversity inclusion training at Foot Locker. So I want to add that little moment. And I love that we changed corporate culture in that way. And I also love that yet again, LGBTQ rights is linked to African-American community in this story. So that's 2004. 2020, a bunch of gender groups and high school students challenged that 1988 law. So let me give you this link. They challenged the law as unconstitutional because it discriminated against gay and lesbian kids because they were the only kids who were told you can't have any information. And it also discriminated against any teacher who had information. So this was in the middle of COVID. Sorry, someone's echoing. In the middle of COVID, the courts struck down a law, our 1988 Comprehensive Health Education Law, and said it's no longer enforceable because it's unconstitutional. So that was a nice triumph in the middle of COVID. And then the third thing, and I don't have a link for this, is just Bostock versus Clayton County 2020. The Supreme Court decision on Title VII of the Civil Rights Act ruled that sexual orientation and gender identity are included under Title VII employment protections. So it's the first federal decision that includes transgender or gender identity in federal protections. And then the fourth link I wanted to give you, and this is from the fourth moment. This is from 2022. This is from just a couple of weeks ago. If you don't know this, South Carolina passed what they called was the Save Women's Sports Act, which prevents any trans girls from participating in women's sports at high school or college level. Public universities are also forbidden from doing this. It really should be called the Stigmatized Trans Kids Act, because that's the effect of it. Already, the South Carolina Athletics Association was addressing these issues on a case-by-case basis. South Carolina has now passed a law that effectively stigmatizes a whole group of kids. So that just passed a couple of weeks ago. And then one more link, and I'm done, and I'm almost done. South Carolina, 2 links. Columbia, South Carolina now has an LGBTQ history page. So I'll put both the links there. It's a wonderful thing. It makes us part of the history of this community. And the second link, by the way, is oral histories. So it's a collection to both the audio versions and the transcript versions of oral histories. Let me end with just 4 quick things. These are my takeaways. Number 1 is your stories matter. And I don't mean this in the simplistic way of everybody come out and you'll change the world, because that's not true. It's simply not true. We like to think in the past that if you come out, we know that people who know gay people are more likely to support gay and lesbian rights in general. But in fact, a study after the amendment campaign found out that people in religious fundamentalist communities and actual families of gay and lesbian people actually get more rigid in their opposition if you come out to them. So for example, my family are totally anti-gay, and even though I'm out, it has not changed them at all. So I don't mean it in that simplistic way. How I mean it is that in the larger sense, telling your story creates understanding and creates empathy. And part of the reason we did the state fair thing was because we had heard that in other states that was a strategy that worked really well on amendment campaigns. Second is that coalitions matter. I remember the 2000 MLK Day March. My husband was the president of Gay Pride and I was the secretary, and we were going to have the group march against the Confederate flag. And we had a member of GLPM say, that's not our issue. And I'm reminded of Mandy Carter. You probably are going to say this later, but I love this thing you said long ago, and I just use it over and over again, that it's about justice, not just us. But we didn't march as a group that year. We couldn't, because someone, actually a donor, threatened to withhold his funding from the organization if we marched. So for me, coalition building is so important. I think gay and lesbian people, and perhaps other groups do this as well, we do what we normally do is we just assume their support as natural allies. We contact them when we need them. We invite them to speak at our events. But what we know is that real coalitions are built on relationships. Real coalitions take time. Real coalition building means being there for them before you ask them to help you. And real coalition building can be hard. Let's just admit that. It can be hard. Third takeaway, long-term thinking matters. I'm just going to throw out one thing. Georgia had way too many organizations, and they fought each other during the whole marriage amendment campaign, and they lost, and they had nothing at the end. Virginia did incredible grassroots work, built all these infrastructure, these rural organizations, all this stuff, but when it was over, they let it die. So they had nothing, again, they had nothing left over afterward. Utah, on the other hand, had lots of organizations, but they worked together. And they also created an infrastructure, and they all along thought, we want to come out of this stronger, even though we know we're going to lose. And that was really what I wanted us to do in South Carolina. And it's how we talked on the South Carolina Equality Campaign about how we wanted to be a Utah. We wanted to build an organization and build a community that would have something lasting beyond the devastating defeat of that amendment. So long-term thinking matters. And fourth and final, and this is my last thing, take care of one another. Man, I got the most viperous emails during that marriage amendment campaign from gay people. I just think we, unlike other groups, ethnic, religious, cultural, we don't have a lot of things we share in how we grew up or how we relate to one another other than our sexual difference. And if we value one another, we have to take care of one another. In GLPM in 2005, I started a thing we called a cultural gratitude, and every meeting began with thanking someone. for what they had done. And I want to say that a culture of gratitude isn't just thanking the people around you who are doing the work, it's being mindful of your history, right? Being thankful for the work of the people who came before you. And with that, I'm going to stop so that we can move on to two people who I think did that work and made things possible for me, and that's Mandy and Harriet.
Ed, a huge thank you, seriously. This is just, and what I appreciate about this, I actually wrote my notes down so I don't stray. But if we don't tell those stories about how, when, where, who, my fear is that people come along and whatever they know, they don't know, but capturing it. But also, I'm actually going to say a huge thank you to Harriet Hancock. I've been in my apartment in Durham, North Carolina for 2 years and 3 months. So when I got the invitation, Dr. Green and Brett and Becky, well, we're going to have our class number 9, May, we'd like to have you. Could you join us from Zoom? I said, no, I'm going to pop down and visit Harriet Hancock, and I'm right here. I'm in her dining room. She's in her office there. So I just want to extend that. First of all, the title of this is so spot on. I'm reading it. It says race, class, gender, oppression, resistance, and here's the important thing, lessons learned from South Carolina's gay and women's movement. Well, here's something we have in common. I live in Durham, North Carolina. Can we mention the names of Strom Thurmond from South Carolina and Jesse Helms from North Carolina? That little North Carolina, South Carolina thing goes way back. I mean, way back to the days of the Klan and, anti-women, anti-people of color. And so for the idea that we have 2 states and looking at the kind of what's happening in the South, there's an old statement, so goes the South, so goes this country. And I truly believe that. But before I begin, I want to just give a little background on this. I was raised for my first 18 years as a ward of the state of New York. Our mother had us, myself, Ronnie Carter, and Dolores, and she left. And I was raised in 2 orphanages and a foster home up in upstate New York. I don't know who's on this call, but if anyone either has been, will be, or potentially either of being orphan or foster homes or group homes, I only want to mention this because I think it's important to realize who we have in this conversation with, and we can't make any assumptions. But the other one that I think is good for this conversation, and I'll make my bullet points as well. When you think about post-World War II baby boomers, people born between the years of 1946 and 1964, at one point, we were the majority of the population in this country. And thank you to anyone on this call who was born before 1946. Well, we just found out this incredible demographic, and I'm so happy to be on this call, is that anyone who's 18 years old to 40-year-olds now outnumber us. So we already have a built-in potential multi-generational opportunity in terms of women, people of color, LGBTQ, name me whatever that might be, in terms of why this conversation is important now, but also going forward. So I just want to make some points, and then I'll, make sure there's enough time for Harriet, and then Q&A as well. So I bring you greetings from Durham, North Carolina. I just want to say that. I wasn't born there, but I found out my birth mother was born in Edenton, North Carolina. So that's an interesting connection. So in a way, this is sort of a homecoming, Ed, because what you just went through about why we had North Carolina Pride happening already, but when I got an invitation, when you all decided you wanted to do your first South Carolina Pride that was 32 years ago. And so when I came down, it was doing nothing more, Harriet, you know this, and anyone else on this call, was to talk about how we did it, where we did it, what that would all mean. But that interesting conversation, because I got the invitation, is now when you think about this 32 years later in 2022, when you still have Pride and what's going on with that, had there not had been that invitation extended, I never would have been down here. But again, because you have the South, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, Louisiana. It's not a coincidence, because that's the old South thinking about back in the day of the Confederacy, the Confederate flag. But I had no idea, honestly. We do a lot of organizing. Dr. Green, I was going to ask you, do you have a School of Social Work on your camp at USC? Is there a School of Social Work? Do we know?
Yes, there is.
All right,
Yes.
and I'm just curious if there's a school of social work, who does anything around orphanage or foster care or group homes? Because that, when you think about one of the reasons why I think I'm actually on this conversation today, when we were in the Albany Children's Home and Schenectady Children's Home, they put us into the public school system. But because they had social studies teachers, this is 64, 65, 66, they would invite outside people to come in and speak. And one of the groups was the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, AFSC, you have them here as well. But when that one gentleman came into my class and talked about what the American Friends Service Committee was about, the Quakers, he said three things. One, basically, is full equality and justice for all. The second one I didn't understand at the time, the power of one, but it was the third thing. They had a high school work camp in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. I went, and it was at that camp. And this is sort of like what you're doing right now, Brett and other folk. They brought in resource people. And one of the couples they brought in was Guy and Candy Carowin from the Highlander Center in Newmarket, Tennessee. It's still there. The Highlander Center was intentionally started to bring Black folk and white folks together, trying to figure out how they could work in partnership in terms of organizing in the South around civil rights. And Guy and Candy Carowin were the white couple, but they took a tape recorder, went down south, and started doing these recordings in the Black churches and also recording the songs that would happen there. But one of the people they were recording from the songs was Bernice Johnson Reagan, who started what? Sweet Honey in the Rock. But that was like, you know, when I was like 17 years old. But I circled back around to that power of one when he mentioned that, because I graduated high school at the age of 18. I had no place to go. I didn't know what I was going to do. But on April 4th, 1967, Dr. King gave us that, you know, questioning beyond thinking about what was happening in Vietnam, you know, breaking the silence. At the time, I was 13 when the 67 March happened, but for him to give that speech, but he talked about economic justice and racial justice, that stuck. And that is now the Poor People's Campaign in 2022. So I'm just thinking about how these interesting kind of historical situations happen, but then what do we do with it going forward? So I want to just give that background on that. So also in 1990, besides coming down and helping with the march, also the Savannah River plant at the time, after Vietnam, a lot of people were organizing, and this might make sense in terms of the timeline for you as well, Ed. A lot of people after Vietnam was over, they took their lives back. They had stopped, they had started families, went back to school, trying to figure out everything they could do, because that war went on for 10 or 12 years. But a lot of people understood it wasn't just that particular war in Vietnam. It was around militarism. It was around racism. It was around homophobia, and it was also around male-female relationships. But people began to start thinking about when we were going to start building these Euro missiles to be shipping over to Europe. And one of the plants was right here in South Carolina. So there was an organized effort by the War Resisters League, which I had joined at that point, to figure out how we could have the conversation about nonviolence, resisting the war, and what we could do around these plants that would be, you know, like I said, the nuclear power plant. But one of the speakers was Modjeska Simkins. And I'm sitting here thinking, what was the possibility that we were on the same, and Becky, you sent the flyer. It had the actual flyer on there. I think it was how long that thing went on, but people got arrested at Savannah River. But the moment that I could have that conversation with her, and that was in 1993, that was 29 years ago. And here we are. Why? What keeps us engaged? What keeps us in terms of like, what's the work that we continue to do? So understanding, again, that connection about what that would mean. So I want to just talk a little bit about sort of the thoughts and the topic and the timing of where we are right now. So when I think about race, and I want to just put these demographics out that might help in terms of beyond this conversation now. Now women are now the numerical majority of the population. Remember, at one point, women didn't have the right to vote and marriage was anything but equal. But women are now the numerical majority of this population of this particular country. By 2050, if not sooner, people of color will be. And they should stop using the word minority. That's not only numerically correct, but it's very disempowering. So by 2050, if not sooner, this country will be majority people of color. But the one I'm most excited about, the one that gives me the most hope, was the 18 to 40-year-olds and how we're going to then do an intentional kind of generational, what do we want to do with our baby boomers older? And then you got young children coming up as well. So for me, I would also add another word in there, culture. I'm thinking of the South. I wasn't born here, but now that I've been living here since 1982, when I moved to Durham, North Carolina, there is a thing about culture. We have 100 counties in North Carolina. A lot of them are rural. It's not Durham, it's not Raleigh, it's not Charlotte, it's not Greensboro, but you have the same reality here in South Carolina. It's all those other outlying rural areas where people live, they may or may not have the internet. But then trying to figure out what would be the things, and this is the question and the challenge I think I've put before us thinking about this. So given where we live, what language we speak, how old we are, who we know and whatnot, what would be the 4 or 5 things, no matter what we wanted to do, that would maybe have a common understanding about why we should be in conversation with each other, and not only in English. So Ed, what you just laid out to me was a great way to kind of give that backdrop. This is what I'm thinking: clean air, clean water. No one should be hungry. No one should be homeless. Everyone should have access to an education, and everyone should have access to healthcare. And then if we went around the room, and even though we're here virtually, and this might come up in Q&A, what would be the other things you would add? What do we have in common? Not what divides us, but what brings us together. And I would tell you right now, that incredible Supreme Court decision in 2015 with Edie Windsor, she won it. But that same Supreme Court all but gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And you see what's happening right now. You know, so if we want to talk about what puts us in the same conversations, what puts us in the same room, what puts us in the same dynamic, and how do we kind of like support each other, figuring out how we can also share our stories. Celine, thank you so much for the thing you read in the very beginning. Really got to the point of it. So I'm just saying, you know, I'll kind of wrap this up because I don't want to have that much to say. But I would say to you, I would say to you is like, if we had to challenge how that's going to happen, besides that 1990 first Pride March you did, something else happened. North Carolina Pride and South Carolina Pride end up going to Washington, D.C., and we did it as a collective. You might remember this, who was there. We went up and did a joint marching together as a contingent in the DC Pride event up there. And I can remember very distinctly, most people were thinking, there's people here from the South, like who are they and why are they here? But the PFLAG contingent got like cheers and whatnot. But that's when we did that march up in DC. But then for Stonewall 25, that was what year that was. We ended up going to New York City and being in that Pride March and Stonewall 25, and here we are, Stonewall 50 just happened. So what happens when you create these relationships? What keeps us pulled together? But more importantly, how do we make sure people are invited? Just like if they hadn't invited me to come, that one guy to come into my classroom and talk about the Quakers. But I guess it's a challenge, it's an opportunity. How do we know beyond our usual suspects that we would have people in? And then the final one I would say is the town gown dynamic. I'm living in Durham, North Carolina. We have 11 historically Black colleges up in North Carolina. You've got North Carolina Central University in Durham, and you got Duke. Had it not been for some folk from both campuses trying to find out how do we have conversation, how do we figure out what would be relevant to all of our lives? But also you had the Pauli Murray Center that's sitting there. Pauli Murray, who didn't go on that 1947 Journey of Reconciliation ride, along with Ella Baker. But these women were thinking it has to be more than just beyond this one action we might do. The Journey of Reconciliation, questioning what was happening around war, what was happening around the right to ride on a bus, and what was happening with that. So it's an opportunity, it's a challenge. I'm glad I'm down here. I'm going to be here for a week. I'll be back down again. But not just to be on this, I'm hoping there might be some other activities that we can be a part of. And I would love to get over to your school, Dr. Green, if you have that opportunity for the invitation, but also any high school or whatever, not just me, but organizations like the Warrior Sisters League and other groups as well. And also the National Organization of Women, thinking about what's happening with the women dynamic as well. So that's all I have. I think I wrote one final thing. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when, not if, but when, and how do each one of us decide in our own lives and times, whatever that might be, of how we want to be engaged. And please figure out how we continue to extend that invitation. And then the best way I can turn it over to Harriet is this: we do not win without allies. We don't win without the college campuses. And if anyone had to share this story about why, how, what, and the fact that I'm sitting in this house 32 years later after 1990 Pride March is an honor and humbled. So I'll pass it on to Harriet Hancock. And thank you so much again, South Carolina Progressive Network, for having me on here tonight. I'll put some links in the chat.
So is it my turn?
Yes.
Well, I'm going to begin by giving you a bit of background on myself and how I got to where I am. But first of all, I want to say to the Progressive Network and to the Modjeska Simkins School for having me. I'm honored to be here. And two of my people that I admire the most in the whole world as activists are certainly Ed Madden and Mandy Carter. And I'm happy to be on this program with them. Okay, I guess I would consider myself sort of an unlikely activist because I became an activist late in life. I was born in Columbia, raised in Columbia, got married when I was 18, and my husband was in college at USC. And when he graduated in '59 with a degree in electrical engineering, we moved north. We moved to New Jersey, and we kind of moved all over with his job. We lived in Florida. He was in the space program once, and then he worked for the federal government, and we sort of moved all over. And I had 3 children. My oldest daughter, Karen. My middle child is Greg Hancock, and he lives in Atlanta and works for CDC. And my youngest daughter, Jennifer, who is also an activist for many things. Right now, she works for the AFL-CIO, trying to get unions organized in South Carolina. What a job that is. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. When my husband passed away, when we were living in New Jersey, my oldest daughter at that time was finishing college. Greg was a senior in high school, and Jennifer was about 12 years old. And after he died, I knew I had to come back to South Carolina where my family was because I needed their support. We were kind of all at loose ends about a lot of things that had gone on in my marriage, and my husband died an alcoholic. So we were all kind of broken people at the time. So my family just put their arms around me and, took care of all of us. And I thought, what am I going to do here? I'm married at 18. I don't have any skills to do much of anything. I had been a hairdresser at one time when my husband was in school, but I had lost those skills many years ago. And I thought, what am I going to do? And I had always thought about going to college, and I figured that if I can find the money and I had some income, that was what I was going to do. So I did. And my son and I were both students at the University of South Carolina at the same time. And that was when he came out to me. People often ask the question, did you know your son was gay before he came out? And I said, I think we sort of had our suspicions. My husband and I both did talk about it a little bit, but then, and I think my son got wind of things like, I think they're getting on to me. So he started dating really pretty women. He's a handsome guy anyway. So he kept bringing all these pretty girlfriends home, and we thought, well, he's not gay, but he was doing that as a cover up. So when we got to South Carolina, and he was in school, like I said, we were both in school at the same time. He confided in my sister that he was gay, but he can't tell mom because she's already suffered so much with, my husband's death and everything. So we just can't tell her. It'll just really shake her up. So my sister finally said, you have to tell your mother, and she's not going to throw you out of the house or anything because she loves you. So I can remember when he told me that he was gay, I acted like, oh my goodness. I think I said these exact words. Oh my goodness, what's the matter? I thought you'd got caught smoking pot or you wrecked the car or something. I was acting like I could have heard much worse news than that. And I knew that I had to say something to give him some relief because I could see the pain in his eyes and the hurt. And it was like, this is my child, nothing in the world's going to ever change that. And I love him. And I made him feel good. And we just stayed up half the night, crying and talking and, whatever. But from that day forward, I said, let me meet some of your friends. I want to meet some of your gay friends, some of your friends. And so he said, okay, because I was just interested in trying to find out, more about his life. And so he kept bringing his friends over, and we played bridge, we'd go swimming together, we did things together. So I became sort of their surrogate mother, a lot of them, because they would say to me, I wish my mom could be like you. How did you get to be so accepting of Greg? could you talk to, they just needed help so much for their family to accept them. And it was good for them to see me, but it was also painful for all of us because I just felt so sorry for these kids. So I just figured if I just had the opportunity, what can I do? Then I found out about several groups. One was the Parents of Gays in New York City. And there was one starting in California, and it had a different name, but they were all beginning to come together under the parents, and it was Parents of Gays, Parents, PFLAG, Parents. It later became Parents, Families, and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, but at first it was Parents and Friends of Lesbians, Gays. So I found out about that. I talked on the phone to several people involved in the groups in New York and California, and they sent me this box that said, like your kit to start a PFLAG group. And it was sitting on my dining room table. I kept saying, well, there's that box of stuff, and it's going to tell me how, but the things it tells me how to do, I can't do it. How am I going to get the newspaper to come out and talk to me about wanting to start this group? Well, I did find out that there was a woman at the state news, at this time it was the Record newspaper. Anybody remember the old Record newspaper? And she did an article on me starting that group. And that was a good beginning because that's how I started PFLAG. And in the beginning, it was kind of just about my son, but mostly it was because parents needed help, gay people needed help. There were so many myths about LGBT people that you just couldn't tolerate. So I just felt like, education is the key. Education, education, education. That's it. You've got to, try to get through that barrier of people giving up their stereotypes. So I was convinced that I wanted to do that. So that's kind of how I got started. And it wasn't an easy thing. I kept thinking, I'm not a public speaker. I can remember when I was in high school, we used to have to do book reports and things like that. And my knees would be knocking together and my head would be bobbing every time I had to get up in front of the class and give a report. And I thought, I'll never be able to speak to groups of people, which is something that's going to be required if you're out and be an activist. So at USC, I took a course of public speaking and I learned to do that. So you have to work at it. But there have been so many, I think, good things about PFLAG. I think that, and Mandy mentioned how when you're marching in a parade and people are just yelling and screaming and clapping for you. And I can understand that because they maybe don't have the support of their own families, but they really appreciate seeing families who are supporting their kids. And, we're not at PFLAG, we're not only supporting our kids, we're supporting everyone. We're trying to help everyone work through their issues. And sometimes I remember one young lady that came to our PFLAG group. She was a lesbian, and she came because she said it made her feel good to be there with people that loved their children and that accepted LGBT people. And it was just good to be in our group, just to have that warm feeling of parents who were accepting. And also she was trying to figure out when it was a good time to come out to her parents. And we kept giving her, encouragement and trying to talk to her about that. And finally, we just said, Sherry, you just need to come out to your parents. We think they're going to be okay. And, because you really want to, and it's bothering you that you're not. So when she finally did, her parents were wonderful. They had already suspected that she was a lesbian. And, but I remember how it was good to have the feeling of not only helping parents, but helping gay people that came to the group. So after PFLAG, I got involved with, I realized that there was a need. Some PFLAG groups didn't really believe at that time in advocacy. You just there to support the parents that had gay kids. And, that's what are you supposed to do? And I thought nothing is ever going to change if we don't speak on behalf of our kids, if we don't actually advocate for their rights and to stop the violence against gay people. We just had to get up and tell our stories and, so people would understand. So I was a person that at that time realized that you had to go out and talk to people. You had to go out and dispel the myths. You had to offer not only advocacy, you had to offer warmth and love and information and education. There were so many things that you needed to do through PFLAG. And I think it's had a huge success. I'm like Mandy said, I think that the allies played a great part in this movement. And I, of course, got involved in the AIDS with Palmetto AIDS Life Support Services. And oh gosh, just sometimes when I think about that, I don't know how we ever got through it, but I felt like when I went to Denver to a PFLAG conference about the time AIDS was raising its ugly head. And I knew that when it came to South Carolina, that it was going to be really bad. And it was, because we didn't have the support of anybody. It was just a nightmare, but I think that the advent of AIDS sort of brought a lot of people, not necessarily, they didn't necessarily want to come out as gay. They were forced to come out as gay because the disease affected them or their partner or whatever. And I think that that sort of gave the impetus to, for more and more people to come out and to organize and to march and, demand your rights. And that's what I think happened in South Carolina, that it was not that hard to organize people to get into Main Street as it might have been years before. So I really enjoyed my work with that. I often say that having a gay son is a real blessing to me, because if he hadn't been gay, I wouldn't be involved in a community of people who have been so wonderful to me and that I've enjoyed so much, and that I really appreciate the LGBT community in so many ways. And then of course we got the center. That was another thing. Every time we'd have a meeting to form a pride march or to do something, we'd have to go to everybody's house. And we finally said, well, let's just see if we can't find a place. And Matt Tischler, first he found the first community center over in a little shopping center over on Rosewood Drive. And it was just like a storefront. It was in a shopping center. And it just was nothing but glass all the way around. I said, I felt like I was in a fishbowl. But when we had the opportunity to buy the property over at 1108 Woodrow Street, that was another thing. That was not a popular idea. People within the community and within South Carolina Gay and Lesbian Pride Movement said won't be able to pay for it, all this negative stuff. And Matt Tischler and I said, we just have to do this. So we went out and raised the down payment, worked through it all, and we got that center. And I'm glad that we did, because I think that the center offers so much to so many people, and I'm proud to be a part of that. And it has not been easy. It's never easy for somebody that is an activist, but you celebrate your victories, and they may be small. There may be many more defeats than there are victories, but you celebrate your victories and you move on. And that's what we had to do. When Don't Ask, Don't Tell came down, we were all so disappointed in Bill Clinton. And we said, but we've just got to move on. So we had disappointments from people that we believed in, but you just have to move on, forget that one and move on. You can't just drown in feeling like it's never going to be a success. It's not, because it's going to be. You just have to work, because human rights and civil rights are something that entitle everybody. It's not a special, decree of, it's for everybody. And you don't have, and we say, you don't ask for it. You have it. Just let me exercise my rights, because everybody has the same rights. So that's kind of where I'm going to stop here. I think I've talked long enough, and I'll be glad to answer any questions when we get to the question and answer session. And thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much for being here with us this evening. That was great. That was great, Harriet. So that, again, those were three mini conversations that I think will get us started off this evening, and really thinking a bit about coalition building in the history of the fight for LGBTQ rights right here in South Carolina. So, all right. So I think we have plenty of time for questions, and I want to start us off this evening by posing a question to our three guest speakers, and Brett and Becky, you can also chime in here as well. But could the three of you talk a bit about the importance of coalition building? You've already mentioned this a great deal this evening, but talk to us a bit more about how coalition building is important in activism, especially in the South. I think that this is an aspect of the Modjeska School that's been brought up time and time again with some of our historical lessons. But could you talk a bit about talk a bit more rather about why coalition building is so important? And anybody can start us off here with this.
Well, I'll start and then pass it on. It's funny, I'm glad you mentioned that, Dr. Green. I'm sitting here remembering, maybe we all have examples, but I remember with the National Organization for Women, this is just one example, and people might get this. But how do you decide who's going to get invited to the very first meeting, who's going to form the why and the where and whatnot? And if that list is not more inclusive, then you only start with the people you have initially. But then it gets a little complicated, because not only who are you inviting, but who gets left out. And I'll give a perfect example. And I should have mentioned this earlier, because I have no parents, I didn't have to worry about coming out. That's real. That's a very real thing. When you think about as a person coming out in your family and their family, what that means. There's really a major stories, but not having to worry about that, that meant that I can be out and visible. And I would say this to anyone on this as well. For those of us who are in a position to be out and visible, name, who we are, face, whatever, that ends up being sort of like the face that you cannot see for those who cannot be seen and the voice that cannot be heard necessarily. But I remember when I was going through the National Organization for Women, I have to be careful now because you have chapters. But at one point when we did the go around, I would always say, you know how you do the go around. Hi, my name is Mandy Carter. I don't think we used the pronouns at that point, but I'm a Black lesbian, lifetime member of National Organization for Women. And after that got done, one of the women came over and she said, why was that so important to mention you're a lesbian? That was good to say you're Black, but not the lesbian. But how many groups have done the exact same thing? You know, just don't talk about that part of you. But I remember that, but that's happened several other times as well, because, you know, it depends on who's doing the inviting, who's going to see the invite, but more importantly, who's left out at the table. Is that a better way to say that? And then when you ask the question, but you also might want to wait until everyone's at the table before you decide the when, the where, and the what. Because if you made all your decisions and then look around and go, well, who's missing? Well, we've already decided what we're going to do, and we'll just kind of get them caught up with all due respect. The other one is anyone who belongs to an organization can understand this one. Oftentimes you're asked as an organization to sign on. Can you become an endorser? Or can you sign on to this thing? How many people look to see who's on that list first? Because if so-and-so's on that list, I think that might be okay and I'll add mine. But someone has to be the first one kind of like on that list, and who does the extending of the invitation? And I would ask this question, how many people have been invited to family meals when the big holiday's coming up? Do you invite your friend or not? And, you know, can you invite your partner or not? Or don't talk about that conversation. So I don't know if anyone else on here is a part of the class as well can even relate to that. But Solange just kind of talked about it, but I wonder, but now people are being a lot more savvy. Before you even begin to form the room and figuring out what you want to do, you might want to go through the list of who needs to be at that table. It's not everyone in your Rolodex that you already know. It's like who's missing from the Rolodex and how would you reach out? How would you invite them? And then also not only coming to our table. There's a lot of tables out there, but you have to come to our table. No, you might want to go to other people's tables and try to think of that. So I'll just leave that as sort of an example. And that's happening every day now, particularly with COVID. Everything's on this. And you think about, we've got more people maybe on here than we would ever get in person, but I'll leave it there. So Ed or Harriet, what do you think?
Go ahead, Harriet.
No, go ahead. I'll wait.
I was going to say, I love that, Mandy. You know, when I moved to South Carolina and my parents cut me off, and I should say, I'm one of those people, my parents literally didn't talk to me for a decade, like 10 years, nothing. They returned Christmas presents I sent to them. So in some ways that was very freeing, that I could do stuff here and I didn't have to worry about embarrassing my parents. They had already made it clear they were embarrassed to hell with me and they were not going to talk to me. So in fact, I get what you're saying about not having parents, but I think for those of us who were totally cut off too, it's a similar thing. I'm cut off from them. And so now I'm free to do the work. And I really appreciate what you're saying about being the face for those who don't have a face. I remember back when we were working with the Pride movement, a high school boy from Roebuck, South Carolina, sent a letter to the community center. And I wrote an op-ed that year about how I was marching for him because he couldn't be there. Right? His parents didn't know. And I think that is important, that when you have, and let's call it what it is, it's a kind of privilege. When you have the privilege to be out and can use it that way, I think it's important to use it. I wanted to say too, I love your metaphor of the table. Brett and Becky, you all remember this. Cookie Washington always used to say, coalition building is just going to everybody else's parties. And I kind of like that. It's not just about the work, that we need to do the work, but it's also about celebrating with them and being with them and eating with them and drinking with them and just being part of their community too. And I really like that. And I'm kind of bragging on my husband here, but I remember, you know, when we had the meetings for the South Carolina Equality, now, number one, we had to be coalition building because, again, if just every gay person and their family who supported them voted, we wouldn't win. So we had to build coalitions. But I just remember going to the AFL-CIO. Donna DeWitt invited me, and there's a way in which, you know, I knew Donna from the Progressive Network, but they didn't, honestly, they couldn't care less that I was president of the, or direct, whatever I was, chair of the campaign at that point, or that I was a professor from USC. The thing that seemed to ring true to them, and I think I put this in the article, was when they mentioned that my husband had organized the water station for the longshoremen's, the Workers' Rights March, right? So it was the gay guys, specifically Bert, my husband, who organized ice water for that Workers' Rights March at the State House. And that was more important than my being a figurehead there and talking to them, because that showed that we had already been on the ground working with them and for them. And I don't know if that really answers your question, Robert, but I do think I love Cookie's point that it's about going to everybody else's party, but I also just want to insist it's about being there for them, for other groups, for other movements, before we have the gall to ask them to be there for us.
Okay, I think one of the most important things, and I don't know if you call it coalition building, I guess, is to become very familiar with our, say, sheriff's department, because I can tell you all that without Leon Lott, he has helped us in so many ways. He is LGBT friendly. He has gays and lesbians on his force, and I think his number 2 person is a lesbian, Roxanne Metz. And I just think that it's important to get to know the people that are going to be, that you're going to have to call on at times, and, you know, to try to build friendships there. And we certainly have with Sheriff Lott. And I also think that it's really good when LGBT people start going to different churches and staying there and making a difference and working toward better understanding of the LGBT community, so that the people in the churches can begin to understand, which they do. I think we have a lot of action now in churches where they're becoming, different churches are becoming what they're calling reconciling Christ, and much more accepting of LGBT people. And I think it's important to reach out to try to make friends with the city officials. I mean, many people on the city council, I think I'm friends with a lot of them. You know, and I think that they've been very helpful to us. So I think it's important to try to develop friendships there and better understanding within the city and with the officials and the, you know, law enforcement. That's just my take on that.
Dr. Green,
Right.
could I just give one more real quick?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Please.
You know, one of the things, I'm really kind of heartful in a really wonderful way. These conversations are so important. And again, even we're doing this on Zoom, hopefully we'll be able to be in person. But I remember when what is now the National Black Justice Coalition was actually called the National Black Gay and Lesbian Leadership Forum. And one of the things that kept coming up was, what is the relationship with that to the NAACP, let alone the Black churches, the NAACP? And then when the National Black Gay and Lesbian Leadership Forum decided to move on, then we formed the National Black Justice Coalition. Will be 20 years old next year. And one of the things that happened, we had a press conference. This is around marriage equality. And remember that Loving versus the state of Virginia, that was a 5-4 decision by one. But the fact that it was called Loving versus the state of Virginia, I'm not a lawyer, here you are. You couldn't think of a better name of the case and they won. I won. But that did not mean people woke up the next day going, oh yeah, sure. No, they hated the idea. But time, hearts and minds and public policy over time, you began to see the difference. And anyone who's a baby boomer, that happened in 1967. We graduated in 1966. And it was all in the South. It was state by state, you know that. So for that win, that meant in our lifetime, we got Barack Obama, son of an interracial marriage, and Kamala Harris, but you know who laid the groundwork. Shout out to Shirley Chisholm. Shout out for Fannie Lou Hamer. Remember Freedom in Mississippi. But I raised that because I remember when we had the conversation, we had this press conference at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. Only one reporter showed up. And we had like Black couples, like a Black lesbian couple, a Black gay male couple. And we were just trying to say that, remember where this started, not gay marriage, marriage equality. And women were at the front and center of that, women. And we said we just wanted to have some conversation about why it was important, but also going back to where it all started, kind of the conversation we had now. One reporter showed up from the Washington Post. The very next day, we get a call from, oh my mind, one of the first Black legislators in Georgia. Oh man, this is embarrassing. Someone better help me. The head of the Julian Bond. Julian Bond. He calls up and says, what can I do to help? That conversation led to, for the first ever in 100 years, 100, for the first ever NAACP, the National Black Justice Coalition, LGBT. And you had a lot of chapters who said, we ain't interested, then don't, then move on. But the importance and just the sincerity of that, but why did it take 100? Here we sit in year 2022. You know, so when you got that big win, this is why I'm a little concerned about how we get into divide and conquer, is that if you had the win and then you had, is it Oglethorpe? The first one, and then you got the win with Edie Windsor. And the fact that they went to the court, they won, but that's the same year they decided to have got the Voting Rights Act. I only share that because had there not been somebody who would say, yeah, let's go ahead and try that. We don't care. It doesn't matter. I don't know where we would be today. So it matters when you step up. And I think, Marjorie, you and I had this conversation. We were sitting at that center about what that meant then, what does that mean now? And look at all the folk coming in behind us and people coming before us. I'm humbled and honored, but that was one of those moments because someone just asked the question, what can I do to help? I'll just leave it there, but that was a perfect example. And NBJC will be 20 years old next year. And we intend to, and Julian Bond is passed on, but doesn't matter. You know what I mean? So I just wanted to share that because it does matter. People steps up, people make the risk and say it's important for us to figure out what we want to do. Marjorie, I'll turn it over to you.
I'm probably the oldest one in the room. Not probably, I am.
I don't know about that.
So, and again, things, I got you. Things come back to me, and I even though I remember one of my very first clients as a social worker in foster care and placement, Children's Aid Society, thank you very much, was ultimately determined to be a gay child, as the way which they described him. We got this gay child, what are you gonna do about him? And I said, well, I don't know, but what's the issue? Well, interestingly enough, he was very comfortable with his then foster parent. His parents, who had abandoned him, accused the agency of making him gay. So again, I mean, the issues that were going around, and I had not a clue. And interestingly enough, one of my sources ultimately became Julian Bond.
Wow.
Okay. And I simply because I was saying to everybody, where do I go for information? What am I going to do? I didn't know. And that is a slight on my profession, which did not give me enough preparation to deal, and certainly not to learn how to be an advocate, which I did. And ultimately, I became the gay social workers in terms of they were assigned to me to place. So I had to, in fact, develop my own course of study, my own information, how to make a determination about who was going to be a good foster parent before I placed, what was too much information, what was not enough. I did have enough folks in the gay community to help me, which they did. I must have called them every night. Where are we going from here? And so again, when I left that particular agency, I did say, you've got to do something. You have got to be prepared. If you say you are interested in the safety and the protection and the development of children, that you know what you're doing. And it was a big, and of course, then I move here and I run into the people at PALS. And I said, you know, I had a little bit of experience with that in New York. And I was recruited to provide some other kinds of services here through that agency, which I became a big part of, and ultimately one of their chairs. So again, big circle goes all around and all around. But again, what I am now thinking to myself as I listen to you all is I haven't been doing anything lately, advocacy-wise, to make sure. I don't know what they do in South Carolina with gay children in placement. I don't know that, but I'm going to find out. Thank you.
Thank you
I
very
just
much.
want to say,
Oh, go ahead, please.
one thing, I didn't want to leave this out, but the first group that PFLAG formed a coalition was the Progressive Network. And I think that was in the Progressive Network's infancy, but it was the first organization that we joined. And that was where we found a lot of friendly people. And thank you, Brett.
Robert, that sets me up, but I want to let Becky take first shot at this because she was there in that first meeting when we formed the Progressive Network, coming out of a 20-year period with the Grassroots Organizing Workshop, which was all about relations. And relations is what you use to build a community with, which is what forms a coalition, which is predicated on trust through experience. Becky, you remember that first meeting at Penn Center? Speak to her.
Yeah, I do remember that. It was been to Penn Center, you really must go because just the vibe of the place is very, very clear. Just the slow moving fans and the worn floors and it's just its own beautiful setting with its own rich history. So to find ourselves in the same rooms where Martin Luther King and other John Lewis and all these stalwarts of the movement had been organizing decades before we came was just really an honor. So we all were aware of that when we were trying to conceptualize this coalition. We had an idea of lifting everybody's boats in a state where everybody was getting their ass kicked. So we thought the most, we can all benefit from working together. We're stronger together. We have the numbers. We just need to organize ourselves. So that was the main issue. But back to this point about, trying to define this new thing, we spent 2 days just hammering out a mission statement, which was painful, but very useful as well. And one of the questions that came up was, how wide do you cast your net? Do we want to involve women's groups who are advocating for reproductive rights? Do we want to involve labor and organizations who are not popular? At the time, I think we were probably the second least unionized state in the nation. So do we really want to go out on that limb without having, what's the benefit of that? The other thing was, do we invite gay folks? A lot of us had already been in the room with gay allies and we had strong opinions about that. And so we hashed around all of these things, and the guy that had come in to help facilitate this thing came from Missouri. And their coalition was very narrow because they realized that there's only so much power and so much juice you can squeeze out of this lemon. And so they had a very narrow labor-based organization, and it worked for them. We knew that we didn't have that kind of same pool of activism to feed off of. So we took a leap of faith and we decided this is who we're going to be. We are going to create this mission statement. And if you haven't read it, you should find it on our website. But it included all of those folks. It was reproductive rights. It was, in alliance with, at the time, it was just gay people. We called them gay people. It was just, but it was a very, I thought, very risky, but the smartest thing we ever did, because that kind of creating that safe landing space for a broad coalition. If you believed in our mission statement, we welcome you, we support you, we honor you, we'll be there for you. And we really were committed to that. And I think it has served us well all these years, because I don't know everybody has said it in their different ways, but all of this work at its core is really about relationships and having experiences with people and building trust. Without that trust, you've got nothing. So it really is all about that. And we started there, and 25 years later, that's still the heart of who we are. And I'm really proud of that decision. And I think that it has served us well.
Thank you, Becky. One, I can't proceed without lifting up the fact that Ed Madden has ruined the position of secretary of the Progressive Network for 20 plus years after he was. The guy wrote these like epistles that you go back and you read and you appreciate. And they were the minutes of our meetings. And Ed was one of our first secretaries. We had, the network was started in 96 after discussions that started at Grow in 92 and 94. And 94 was when the Christian Coalition took over South Carolina. And we had already been by then doing 20 years worth of work with the Grassroots Organizing Workshop, had been coming out of the anti-war movement, coming out of the civil rights movement. We were totally aware we were going, we couldn't win without friends. And Modjeska's saying was, I'll work with you if you're going my way. And then the thing that smashed that militant human rights movement that she was so effective in the 30s and 40s, it was a diverse thing. I mean, Du Bois's speech in 1946 at the Township Auditorium for the Southern Negro Youth Congress talked about the necessity of liberating working class whites by working together with each other because we have the same oppressor. So that is like a simple message that keeps getting lost. We have to keep repeating it. And so we inherited that from jump, and we have maintained that, and we've been dancing with all kinds of parties, and we need some more of that. So our idea now, we're trying to kind of reestablish this for the third resurrection of the progressive movement here in South Carolina, is to be able to have a beloved community center where we share values. This is a hard time, folks. We ain't gonna make change fast. And we're seeing a lot of people that are just kind of bailing out and giving up. And what we've got to do is like bank the coals and support each other and be there with a strategic way to make a difference by winning some fights that we pick very carefully. And so I want to thank Ed. And I was at Becky and I were at your first faux wedding where it didn't work, and it was your real wedding in Charleston. And Harriet, Harriet's got some role in me meeting Becky when she was working for the Bar Association before 1991, when she stumbled into Grow with a story they wouldn't run about the AIDS movement, and she checked in and never left. And so the relationships really are what it's about. Dr. You want to take questions from the floor? Becky's got something else to say.
Just before we wrap up, I'm so sorry. I just have to say this because I've got Harriet here, and oh Lord, I love her so much. And good God, I just have to say that what she has done for South Carolina is so important. And it was an honor to tell her story. Good God. And she is such a dear person to me. And I will always, one of the reasons that we fought so hard in Penn Center to make it as inclusive as possible is my experience with Harriet and the community that she exposed me to that set me on the path of activism. So I credit her with me being here tonight. And it's just such an honor to be in her presence, and with Mandy, who's helped kick this off, and with Ed, who's been part of the network forever, and all those damn meetings that we've sat in, and it just sometimes seems so hopeless, but I love you guys so much. And with that, I'm gonna just say thank you.
Let me point out the book that Becky mentioned is about Harriet, and you go to modjeskaschool.com or the Progressive Network, you click on booklets, and there's a booklet about Harriet, and you can, well, I think we need to reprint that. We'll have to raise some more money, but thank you, Becky.
No, thank you so much for that, Becky. That's a great reminder of why we all do what we do and why we're all here this evening. There's so much we have to do. There's so much to fight for, but we need to remember who we're fighting alongside, and that these people are all really important to making this a better place. So I want to get to the Q&A. I know that Celine and Greg have some really good questions in the chat coming up. I know that Dr. Madden had a question that he was going to ask as well. So I'll defer to him first, and then Celine, and then Greg. So Dr. Madden.
Thank you. I just want to ask Mandy a question and maybe get her to talk a little bit more about this. But before I do, I want to say I love you, Becky. I love you, Brett. And also, I love you, Harriet. And I posted 2 links in the chat to when Harriet was named part of the Columbia City of Women, and also her interview for the USC Second Wave Feminist Movement Oral History Project. She's included in that as well, so I'll put it in the chat. Mandy, I'm fascinated by the point you made about the fact that the court that gave us Windsor also eviscerated voting rights. And when I teach Windsor, I talk about the fact that it did set the precedent that made marriage equality possible, but it's really about inheritance and money. It's 2 rich white women wanting to protect their inheritance. So it's a really complicated moment. And I guess I'm mindful of the question that came up earlier in the chat, and I just said yes to, but the question that does capitalism create these elites within movement? So just as Bayard Rustin argued against a black elite, is there a rainbow elite? This I don't know. I want you to say more about that moment. To me, and that is fascinating.
I'll respond to that, and if anyone else has to, you know what I find interesting, Ed, it wasn't just the Loving versus Virginia decision. I'm thinking about when Thurgood Marshall took on that case around, wasn't it that famous case about the schools? And the best way I know how to what was it?
Briggs v. Elliott was a South Carolina that went on to become Brown.
And put that in the mix as well. Here's the question I have. I just wonder, first of all, this is me. I think we had to do race. It was a white man married to a black woman. It was always the other way. We ain't gonna have no black men marrying white women. That was, I have to go back, and I'll be curious with you, Dr. Green. Let's think about that, what that meant. But that was a 5-4 decision. And by the way, Clarence Thomas, when that decision happened in 2015, you know what his comment was? Don't even get me started. Well, I don't know, 50 years seems good enough for me. He's in an interracial marriage. I mean, the hypocrisy is just astounding. But I also wonder this, when you think about the fact, this is just interesting, because if you go state by state by state by state, and you look at where change had to happen, it was the old South. Harriet made an interesting observation. She said, what used to be the old Republic, in fact, Jesse Helms was determined to be a Democrat. He was a Jessicrat, whatever that was back in the day. But I think it's around race. I don't think it is about class. Who can afford, who cannot? But here's the one that I find most disappointing. You also had a don't ask, don't tell. The minute we get what we want, do we just leave and say, I've got mine, I'm good? That's exactly what happened. And the other one, I'll say this honestly, I'm fired up right now. Who was the face of marriage equality? Who was the face of don't ask, don't tell? If you have no that was women and people of color who had to go for both of those. We came here as property. So around the military and around marriage equality, it was people of color and women. And now we look, this is what excites me though, but look where we are now. Women are the numerical majority, people of color will be. And you think about now the generational thing, think about the excitement of that. So when I'm looking at is absolute desperation, there's nothing left. But if we continue to divide ourselves, I've heard more people said, I can get married now, I'm good, I don't need anything else. Really? You don't care about anything else? Until all of a sudden, all of their income might be jeopardized. You mentioned it, Ed, and other people. But you have to wonder, so what do we do to rise above, is it just about me, I've got mine and I'm good? Or do you make sure, and I'll just say this, one of the reasons why I have to be careful, but the people who need to be spokespeople have to be the people who's reflected on who that's going to impact the most. And it cannot always be men, and it always can't be white men, with all due respect, because what you see is what you get. And if you're trying to find out the stories of what has to happen, which is so important about oral history, thinking about why this is important, then all of a sudden it's not just about me, it's about the collective we and how that might happen. But going back, I'm still intrigued by the fact that it was a white man married to a black woman, but also think about, they had their own family saying, don't do it, from both sides. Don't do it, they said, but love, the power of love, which is why the power of P flag, the power of allies, that has, I think, a lot more to do with it. It's sort of like an interesting, don't forget that mix. And they put millions of dollars into anti-gay, anti-marriage. And in fact, you had like the niece of Dr. King, Alveda Celeste King, promoting anti-choice and anti-marriage. Why? Got to debate her as well. So I just think that we need to really think clearly, and also in different languages and cultures about, is it about me or is it about a collective we? I'll stop there. And I hope I'm not getting in any trouble. I don't want to be yelling at me because I mentioned some organizations.
Well, that's actually a really good way to get us our next question from Celine on the chat. She has a, I think, really interesting question here. She wrote, bad faith groups that call themselves men's rights activists currently dominate the mainstream conversation around men's social issues. I'm interested to get the panel's thoughts on how best to bring cisgender's men's issues, e.g., oppressive gender roles, circumcision versus bodily autonomy, family court bias, into the movement for gender equality. So anybody from the panel wants to tackle that question, more than welcome to do so.
I'd be curious if Celine has a question, an answer to her question, their question, and open it up as well. But Celine, what do you think?
I think that every movement towards social progress has a backlash to it, which is we've seen a lot in learning things in this class, and I feel like one of the current issues that we're having with so many young straight white men being radicalized is that they feel like they're being overlooked, when in reality all we're doing is paying more attention to people who've never had the floor before. But to them it's like if they try to speak up, I don't like being I don't like being stereotyped either, or I get made fun of if I cry at a movie, something like that. There's all sorts of issues that are legitimate that we would need to talk about that they feel like they can't talk about without other people saying, that that's not their speak.
That's a really important point. And I would just add, teaching an HBCU, I can assure you, it is not just straight white males who are dealing with this issue either. A colleague of mine at class nights teaches a class on the Black male experience, and there are some academics who look at the Black experience in particular and are saying we need to find a way to talk about cisgender Black men and think about what these kinds of debates, how they impact Black men, other men of color. Because again, as I think has been said repeatedly this evening, we don't want to think of the LGBTQ community as a monolith. And that also means we can't think of these other groups as monoliths either. But I think this is a really important point because the men's rights activists have really gained strength, at least, in terms of online discourse, certainly. They're gaining strength in mainstream media as well. I think this is something that does deserve some more thought. So does anyone from the panel have anything else to add to this question, at least some food for thought for thinking about the men's rights activists, thinking about cisgender men in terms of that?
I would just add, and I say this because we get journals from feminist-based men's rights groups at the Women's Studies program at USC, and we teach courses on masculinity. I guess I would say we need to remember that that's not a monolith either. There are men's rights groups that do not have an adequate conception of gender and are not part of a broader progressive politic. But there are feminist-based men's rights movements that are supportive of that were involved in the Me Too movement and that are very much about undermining the kind of patriarchal, cis, toxic masculinity that might in fact find its home in other versions of men's rights movements. Now, I guess I'm just saying we have to think, we might need to be a little more granular maybe, or a little more specific about those men's rights movements, because some would have a feminist analysis at the heart of what they do, as opposed to a politics of resentment or a politics of loss of privilege. So it would be worth remembering that.
What I'm curious though, and also, anyone else on the call, there was a huge discussion. Why did we have to end up, it used to be called women's studies. Why did we end up calling women's studies and gender studies? Where did that come from? Well, and I don't know if that was geographical, but you saw that. That's still a conversation to this day. Why that, and not just the two are different, right? Go ahead.
Well, we had the argument in 2008 at women's studies at USC, and the two specific reasons we made it gender studies was A, the inclusion of LGBTQ studies as part of it, but B, the inclusion of classes specifically in psychology in masculinity and definitions of masculinity. So that was part of the reason, is that we were enlarging the program both in terms of sexuality and in terms of addressing masculinity. But it's still an issue. It's still an issue now. I mean, we didn't change it totally to gender studies. It is women's and gender studies, because we still wanted to keep women's studies at the forefront, even as we were enlarging the focus.
Yeah. Well, and then I'll add just one more thing. It's interesting because, you know, when you have what with the regular, you know, all the women's colleges, you know, and so let alone, you know, if you think about schools or whatever that might be, to this day, it's still kind of an issue, but also maybe this is a class issue, but I think it's also cultural. All you know is all you know. We have more students going to North Carolina Central University, which used to be segregated in Durham, that come from Eastern North Carolina. And when they come, it's like they're bringing themselves, but who's putting them in school? It's their parents and their grandparents, and how far back you have to go. And real quick, when they started to start the very first gay and lesbian student, whatever it was going to be called, they had a hard time finding a faculty advisor, because back in the day, I understood some people said, I can't do it because that's just my religious, you know, but other people said, I don't want anyone to think I'm gay. What message is that sending to hear that? And had it not been for people like Tia Marie Doxey and really well, she's over there, some of the straight allies, they had more impact on getting that student group. And they had their first ever, you know, you see what I mean about someone willing to take, Becky, I'm thinking about you as well. Who's willing to take the first steps, willing to say, I'll be glad to be the person. And that's an ally. Same thing with you, Harriet. And Dr. Green, what do you do? Have you found, I mean, like you're there, you know what HBCUs are. And when you have like a school of USC, did you think back in the day, but how far back in the day do you have to go before it kind of catches up with, and this is the reality of our life now, you know what I mean? And then I'll add with one final one. What about that town gown dynamic? What about if you're a school in a community and you have activists that are not in the school, but yet there's times when they really need to come together? And I'm thinking about that Muslim band. You know, when you had a state university, when you had North Carolina university system, they couldn't touch it, but Duke could. And you had another system where North Carolina Central University was the key voice. That was critical for them to do that. So that town gown dynamic, do people leave, they never come back? But alumni associations, you have it down here, they're important, they're critical. So I'm trying to think about when you're in, if you're not in, you move on, you know, whatever that all might be. But that all is important, especially looking forward, you know, when you got all these students coming into town. But anyway, just a thought.
Well, I think with that point being raised, these are some great answers. This actually is a good way to transition to Greg's question that he sent to me directly in the chat. And I'll just read it for the panelists, and I want us to think about this question very carefully. Question goes from Greg. My question is about coalitions cooperating and setting priorities, because the political system has a limited ability to absorb change quickly. I am reminded of the dispute between Frederick Douglass on the one hand and Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton on the other, about voting rights in the 1860s, for example. If you look at wealth figures, African American descendants of slaves have a median net wealth in the single or double digits, whereas white LGBTQ net wealth is probably over 100K. Now, again, the number might be a little off, but that's maybe in the neighborhood of that. My question is, does the LGBTQ community realize the relative wealth disparity? And is there any discussion of setting priorities in this coalition and elevating the issues of Black folk? Because for many of them, their economic survival is at stake, unlike the larger LGBTQ community. So again, I do want the panel to chime in on that, maybe offer some answers to that question. Also offer us, more importantly, some food for thought about the question itself in terms of, again, as we've been saying this evening, the LGBTQ community itself is not a monolith. So we have to be very careful in how we discuss this, but please go ahead.
I don't know if I agree with that. This is where I think class might be coming into the conversation. And I just wonder sometimes, this is me, I'm thinking of my organizing, that's all I can really refer to, where what might be an issue, what it might look like race is really class. You got a lot of well-to-do Black folk. You know, you got a lot of well-to-do straight people as well. And I'm getting concerned that it's, you know, and again, it depends on what the context is, because if it's this question of who can afford to buck the system, And by the way, the Loving, none of them had a whole lot of money. That wasn't about that. I just wonder if class comes into it, race. I'm a little worried that it might just be a larger kind of like, is there a sense that LGBT people have a lot more money than other? But there's other parts of that. What happens if you're a woman, person of color, how you self-identify, but we walk around in those multiple identities, and I'm getting concerned that there's sort of like someone said, it's not like a monolith, people of color or gay, straight, whatever, and it might depend on the individual situation. So I'm just worried about that. But also, here's the thing, I don't want to get married. A lot of people don't, but the good thing is you have an option. We didn't have the option before. We should put that in the mix. And when you're telling me you can or you can't, but if you have the option, I don't have to. A lot of people are not interested in getting married. But does that mean I'm against marriage equality? And again, not gay marriage, but marriage equality. And that really had a lot to do with women, but also class issues. I'll just leave it there, but anyone else want to chime in on that? That's my 2 cents worth.
Yeah, I would just echo what you said, Mandy. I think a lot of times when we try to look at the differences of race or differences of LGBTQ versus straight or differences of women versus men, often the real question we're asking is a question about economics, a question about class. And I love how you said that sometimes what looks like race is really a question of class. And I think a lot of times when we talk about LGBTQ people, I mean, it's just like the ways in which people tried to pit LGBTQ people against Black churches, forgetting that there were tons of LGBTQ Black people in those Black churches, right? So it sets up this binary opposition that occludes, that erases, that elides, that doesn't recognize the people that actually would trouble that easy distinction. And I totally get what he's saying, because I think I go back to Windsor decision. Windsor decision was about IRS inheritance. But when I think of the people I talk to here for whom marriage would make a huge difference, it wasn't about IRS and inheritance. It was about children and custody and being recognized in the hospital. I mean, these are basic human economic issues. And I don't know. I mean, I just remember the stories I heard when we were organizing that for that amendment. A man who wasn't allowed to go into the emergency room at MUSC because he didn't have his medical power of attorney with him. And, you know, I know he had the wherewithal to at least visit an attorney and make that. But still, that kind of thing, that was the kinds of stories we were talking about, not the kinds of stories that we had with Windsor. I know I'm sort of going off here, but I just want to echo what you said, Mandy.
Yeah, I agree with Ed about, as an attorney, I heard the stories and why people really valued the right to get married. And it didn't have anything to do with, except we have to protect each other. We have to have laws that will protect us, and we're not protected in South Carolina. And it was more about protecting our children, each other in so many ways. And that was what it was about. It was about recognizing the love we have for each other and being able to protect each other. That was the main thing about the marriage, as far as I could tell. Yeah. And the people that came into my office and talked about their problems and why they needed to get married, it was all about protecting each other.
And can I ask the person who asked this question? I have another one to put in the mix and kind of relates to COVID, but back in the day. Remember when they were doing the Tuskegee experiments with Black men? And remember forced sterilization of Black women? You know, so, and if anything, it's kind of relevant because generationally it was like, why would I trust anyone to give me a shot of anything in my arm because of whatever it might be? And if anyone on here can address that, because you can understand how that's really relevant. And we were just talking about this, people were literally dying. I cannot tell you how many friends of mine have passed because of COVID, but within the Black community. But you know where else it popped up? AIDS. When AIDS first hit, we had the first ever National Black Gay and Lesbian Leadership Forum, went to the first ever AIDS in the Black Community Conference in Washington, DC. You had a doctor from Harlem, the first thing he said, mothers are not gonna sign that death certificate. Because it was almost like whatever you want, there was such a trauma or whatever word you want to use. And because of it, that's almost an interesting kind of way, like AIDS became a white guy's thing because at least they got organized. But think about that moment when that was decided that we do not want to have this look like it's a gay thing, but There was people are passing because of that. But think about the impact of that. And years later, someone finally said, you know what, that might have been an error, but look at the price it got paid. But how many times have we seen that same example? Not want to do that, don't want to get involved, and the first people who step up and get it, and then about the AIDS quilt, 1987. To have that quilt sitting on that mall with, just the panels that were there, it was just devastating. And Reagan was sitting, never came down and even look at that. And here all these years, so I think if we can almost, what I love about this conversation, it's almost like you can get historical timelines. And then how do you learn from those lessons going forward? You don't have to repeat them again. And you hope that people would say, I think we might learn lessons on that, but collectively about the collective we, I'll just say that that's critical, but I'll never forget that conference as long as I live, because that was a very selective decision. We don't make it look like it's a gay thing. That's, whatever. But look what it did to the community. And here we sit with COVID, but yet we have the incredible, and I'll end with the optimism. I think we learned a lot about why we were on such an amazing path right now. The opportunities are just staring right us in the face and figure out what do we want to do collectively in a very positive way.
And can I just throw in one more thing, Robert? It was worth knowing. I like the question in part because I remember this struggle when I was with GLPM, going back to when we wanted to march against the Confederate flag. I was very mindful of the difference between the Human Rights Campaign, HRC, and the task force, or what was at the time called the NGLTF, the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force. NGLTF held the Creating Change Conference. It was multiracial. It was about class. It was about progressive politics in the broadest sense. So that was the organization within which I found my national home. HRC is capitalist. It's DC based. It's about national priorities and national movements and organizing money to affect national change, whereas NGLTF was about organizing people to affect change at the local and state level. So I appreciate the question very much, but in answer to the part of the question was, are there LGBTQ people who are thinking about these issues? There absolutely are. They just may not be as visible as those stupid little equal signs on the back of everybody's car at Whole Foods. NGLTF was doing the work with conferences every summer called Creating Change, where they were trying to organize LGBTQ people toward a much broader politics and a much broader coalition movement.
Right. And those are really important points. And I saw Sarah had her hand raised. So Sarah, please go ahead.
It's just a memory of mine. I was at Harlem Hospital in '82 when the AIDS epidemic was called GRID. And we were seeing AIDS in Harlem, but we had to go to infectious disease conferences and argue that these drug users and prostitutes had that same disease. Meanwhile, the gay men's health crisis downtown was thriving, and St. Clair's Hospital had so much support and big fundraisers, and it was just a cause celebrity. But the people that we had, we couldn't even get them acknowledged by the infectious disease doctors of the community. When we asked for latex gloves, went to the president, Dr. Parker, the president of Harlem Hospital, his response to us was, we didn't need them because there were no gay people in Harlem. So it has, I don't know what that has to do with it, but there was something about the power that the gay community had. And it was my impression at that time, it was because it was all white men. And white men have a lot of money, and a lot of money had a lot of organizational power. People who could fly to France and bring back AZT through South America. And we in Harlem didn't have any support at all. It was because people were poor and Black.
And Sarah,
that's all I wanted to say. Power.
But Sarah, this underscores what I was just saying about when that was happening in Harlem, there was a conscious decision by, like I said, a lot of mothers, some of the church, who didn't want to acknowledge it. And you see the impact of that. On the other hand, because you had what was happening with the AIDS movement, isn't it kind of yin yang? But look at that moment, just how much that turned on that. And in retrospect, they look back and said, "Oh my gosh, whatever." But at the time, what would have any of us done when you think about what that was? But I thank you for sharing what you just said. Thank you. Underscores the point.
And I think this is likely be our last question for the evening, and then I'll wrap up. This is from Amari Fox. He had a question. This is for Mandy, and I think the other panelists can also chime in as well. But Mari Fox wrote, Mandy, have we paused to reflect enough on what it is that we want to do collectively? Can we do it collectively without fragmenting?
And can I ask Marty, what would be the answer to that question before we open it up? Because I'd be curious to what you think about that. Your question itself. What do you think?
I knew you was going to do that.
Yes. But I'm curious. Yeah. What do you think? It's a great question. I think that's the question of the day, man.
I don't think we have to compete for who the most oppresses. Unfortunately, there's more than enough oppression to go around. So to me, I'd like to be in that Fred Hampton, vein of bringing everybody in solidarity under the common cause. But I also think when my people ask me to stand with them or fight for them, and I'm in a position to do so, or lend access or privilege or whatever it is I can do, I don't see that as a loss, for me. But I don't know if we can have that conversation with our lawmakers and other people. I'll close by saying Gilda really scared me with a comment about, it's hard to believe that a lot of the people are religious or believe in God based on the types of laws that they're making. So that's my 2 cents.
I'll respond with a question. I mean, I think it's good because I keep on thinking we don't have to continue to live in a either or. We just keep on doing this either or, but if there's a both and you keep on adding and as we go, it just seems to open up the opportunity. But the other one, and I'll ask this and then I'll pass it on, but I wonder how many times do we self-regulate ourselves? Like when I said about there's a lot of tables, but if we only have our table, you have to come to my table. You have to come to my table, and I'll get to decide what the shape of it's going to be and what it's going to be. But if you have a both and, then it seems like, and also experience, like I'm looking at you, I'm now 72. If I had not gone to that high school work camp when I was 17 years old, why am I here? But what keeps you in the long haul as well? And more importantly, who are you passing it on to? Who's younger than you and older than you, the elders? And also, how much hope do you have? I have this little, I'll end with this. I have this little interesting scale. It's not like technical or anything, but on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being, was there any point getting up this morning? And 10 was bring it. I always wonder when we wake up each day, where am I? Am I a 1, 5, 10, 6, whatever? I'm a perpetual 10. What's the possibility? Remember I said, what if versus yeah, but. I think those 2 sentiments right now, I feel like that's for me, but I think a lot of us are in that. What if all the potential possibilities, whatever that might be, versus yeah, but anyway, I'll leave it there. Where would you put on a scale of 1 to 10 for you? Just it's not scientific, but what's your sense of optimism or hope? And then I'll stop and pass it on for you.
Me, I'm 1 to 10. Some people might say that would be delusional, but I don't know. If you don't look in the light in people and feel like there's light there, then maybe you wouldn't feel that way. But we all come with what we bring to the room. Some a little more scratches and issues than others. But if we can still see the light, why not unite and get together?
I think that's a wonderful place for us to wrap up this evening. So I wanted to once again thank Ed Madden, Mandy Carter, and Harriet Hancock for joining us for a wonderful and thought-provoking conversation this evening. And I wanted to ask Brett if he had anything he wanted to add before I close this out this evening. Brett, anything you wanted to add to tonight's conversation?
Well, I'm just thrilled all these people stayed for the whole show, and that we're doing what we need to do. Just banking the coals and keeping the flame alive. And learning from the struggles that have come before us and building on them. Really important part of the Justice School. And thank you, Mandy and Ed and Harriet, for longtime friendship and more to come. And Becky. And Mr. Fox, the uprising of the new generation here, the youngster, the oldest youngster I know.
Well, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Robert, I was just going to say that I have to get ready to go to Atlanta here in a little while, and then we have an opportunity for people to stay with an open mic and chat after class. We turn the recording off, and you can say what you want to. And Mr. Fox is going to handle it this evening. So stay around if you got something to say.